Now, don't accuse me of not being fully behind the railway workers. I addressed the annual conference of the National Union of Railwaymen, as it was then called, more than 40 years ago at their annual conference in St Andrews in Scotland. The theme of my speech was regeneration. Then not really a word as much in use as it later became in not the most salubrious of circumstances. I talked about the natural phenomenon of how when you damage a twig, it regenerates, and I was lecturing the National Union of Railwaymen on the need for the labour movement to regenerate. 40 years on, it is the Railway Workers' Union that is itself regenerating faith in trade unionism, in an alternative to how Britain is. I took a trip down the railway. Here's what I had to say.
At first, it was faintly amusing, the sights and sounds of florid-faced, fat cat journalists and broadcasters fulminating, vituperating about the wages some members of the Rail, Maritime and Transport Union, the RMT, are earning. But by no means all members, of course. First, they tried to inflate the number to imply that every person working on the railway is earning £57,000 a year, if only. And of course, insofar as railway workers are keeping up, by and large, with the rise in the cost of living, that's because they've got a union, organised, well-led, determined, together and strong. But they quickly realised when the first opinion poll showed that half of the British public support the railway workers' strike for an inflation level pay settlement. And that's an important qualification, you know. Because of course, if you get a pay rise that is less than the level of inflation, you just got yourself a pay cut. Anyway, back to the fat cat journalists and broadcasters. Not a single one of Britain's journalists is earning less than double the wages of the railway staffs. And some of the worst offenders, I'm thinking Tory boy Pierce, for example, are, to my certain knowledge, earning 10 times the amount of the railway workers whose greed he was denouncing hourly on social media, daily in print, and daily on your television set. Now, I don't know about you, but I find it impossible, actually, because I'm an empathetic person, to imagine denouncing someone who earns 10 times less than me for greed. It just doesn't compute with me. Anyway, they got stuck with the opinion poll. It stopped them in their tracks. When it turned out that despite all of their propaganda, that the public, half of the public polled, fully support the rail workers' strike, they realized they had a problem. And that's when it went from faintly amusing to very dark indeed. Blood on the tracks. Here's what happened. Despite all of my political experience and despite the bitter experience of the last few years, I didn't see this one coming. The Guardian, where else this week, reporting an unnamed high labour source, raised the spectre, I'm not making this up, that the RMT, the Rail Workers' Union, might be anti-Semitic. Keir doesn't think Mick Lynch, about whom more later, the RMT leader, is himself anti-Semitic, But Keir thinks he has to explain how the RMT has become a, quote, unsafe space, unquote, for its Jewish members. This one bowled me over. I really didn't see it coming. I knew that this so-called Labour Party was a debauched, degenerate, caricature, disfigured, distorted version of a Labour Party, but I never thought that even a Labour Party that had banned its MPs from joining the picket lines of the rail workers and told its frontbenchers that they'd be sacked if they turned up on a picket line, I never thought they would go that low. I never thought that they would descend into that pit of attacking workers striking for a living wage with the smear of anti-Semitism. Now, frankly, I doubt very much whether that will cut through with the public. I doubt very much if the railway workers will even know what on earth Starmer is talking about. But it was an early sign that those who wished to see the defeat of the railway workers realized that actually the side that's going down to defeat in this dispute is them and the system that they represent. And then a so-called conservative grandee, Tobias Ellwood, on national television, begged the railway workers not to be Putin's friends. Putin, he said, would be delighted at this disruption, like Putin is sitting in the Kremlin charting the course of a railway worker strike. What is this, 1926 or 2022? Is Putin Lenin? And are we in the middle of an existential general strike, a struggle for power, as we were in 1926? This is an everyday trade union dispute with a group of workers who turn out to be, even by the admission of their enemies, an important section of the British working class, trying to get themselves an inflation level wage increase. In other words, to stand still on where they were last year. Anti-Semites, Putin's friends, you must be very worried indeed. But on another level, they should be worried. Because if the railway workers win, that will embolden other sections of the British workforce to demand a wage increase that at least keeps them exactly where they were the previous year. It's not their fault that this week inflation in Britain reached the highest level for 40 years, 9.1% and rising. It's not their fault. It's not their economic system. They don't own it or run it. They didn't declare war on Russia and implement a whole package of self-damaging, self-harming sanctions. It was the people who own and run this country that did that. Why should the workers pay for it? Mick Lynch is so good in being interviewed on television, a number of my supporters asked if I'd been giving him lessons. Well, the truth is, I've never met him. His brilliance is entirely his own doing. But one by one, as the famous film actor Hugh Laurie pointed out on social media, he wiped every picador, taunting him, sticking their spears into him on every single television channel and every news bulletin. Dispassionate, calm, cool, collected, Mick wiped the floor with them. So much so that these highly paid pundits and broadcasters simply didn't know how to handle him. Here was a man taking no nonsense from them. When they accused him of greed, pointed out that there are more billionaires in Britain this year than there have ever been, that the richest people in this country are richer than they have ever been, that even the bosses on the railway that are denouncing the railway workers are earning 10, 20, 30, 50 times more than some of the workers that they are denouncing. Where's the productivity bonuses and recognition from them? Mick wiped the floor with them because he's an honest trade union leader. And God strengthen him. May he win for his members a great victory. I was a very good friend of the late and great railwaymen's leader, Bob Crow. May he rest in peace. And how I wish he could see his members in action again. They hated Bob Crow, but he didn't care. He was a Millwall supporter, after all. We are Millwall, we don't care. I'm Bob Crow, you don't like me, I don't care. My job is not to please you. My job is to win wages and conditions for the members who elected me. Bob had a very clear attitude to money. I don't care whether the money has the Queen's face or the Queen's arse on it, he said. All I care about is how much of it is in the wage packets of the railway workers of Britain. God bless you, Bob Crow. God bless the members of the RMT, not just because if a group of workers are so important to the economy that they can bring it to its knees simply by not coming into work, if hundreds of millions of pounds are lost by the virtue of the fact they didn't turn up for work, then that means they're underpaid. That means we're not valuing their contribution well enough. Not just because I love the railway workers and the RMT, no, but because it's time that the working class got off their knees and stood up and demanded their rights. And that's all the RMT are doing. One day, because nobody ever accused me of not being an optimist, one day I believe that all unions will be like the RMT. The all workers will be like the railway workers. And when that day comes, the world will belong to those who make it, who build it. It will belong to the workers. 99% of the people are workers. And one day, this economy will belong to them.